But to transition now from foreign policy to economic expansion during this time period, we're entering in an era now which is termed by historians as the market revolution. And what the market revolution is defined, it should be a term you saw in your course and also in your classes with your history instructor. It's a term that means we're seeing the American economy shift from very local subsistence-based production and community-oriented economics into more regional and even national markets spread over large areas of states or even the vastness of entire regions or the continent in terms of production of goods for trade, exchange, and profit rather than my own home use. Coming along with this economic expansion were a couple key elements. Population and transportation were key. And something that has always been a real stumbling block for students on the AP exam is the idea of putting events in order. Many students know their history. They know the factual history, but they can't always get their chronology right. And chronology saves and chronology kills. If you know chronology, it saves in terms of your work. If you don't know chronology, you put the right history in the wrong places, and that kills for your chances for success on the AP exam. So in one small, modest area to start with transportation and the evolution of this sort of growth and development at the national level, consider the road era, the canal era, and the railroad era. As the slide before you shows you, there's more or less discrete eras. And it doesn't mean that there were no roads being built beyond this time, but we're talking about a point in time in which each of these three transportation elements was the central driving form of transportation that was being developed. It should make sense to you that we'd begin with roads. Roads are the simplest thing to build. You cut down trees, you clear the paths, you go forward with the least amount of resources you can advance and do this. And the road era would have began in 1810 to 1825, would have been the height of this sort of construction as the dominant transportation model of the era, financed publicly and privately, states being involved, raising bond levies for this, and even the federal government through the National Road had established their first involvement in internal improvements during this time period as well. The canal era follows, around 1820 to 1840, and even before you get to the end of the canal era, you already have the railroad emerging as the new technology. And to lay this out a little, we're going to switch maps for just a second. Now, if you can see on the map a little bit closely, I know it'll be a little bit hard, but it'll do for our purposes. You can see that some of the black and white checked areas represent areas where canals were developed. You'll notice the pattern that most of the canals being developed are being developed in the north, the northeast, tying the northeast to the northwest. Roads will sort of do the same thing, as we're going to talk about them in a little bit. The National Road was our first major road project, which headed from from Washington, the Cumberland Road, over through Wheeling, West Virginia, turning into the National Road through Ohio, ultimately ending somewhere around Vandalia. Curiously enough, today, this is the route of Interstate 40 and Interstate 70, I believe, or U.S. Route 40, Interstate 70, through Columbus, through Indianapolis, all the way down through St. Louis. The idea was to obviously move populations. And when we talk about populations and their goods, notice the transitions that take place in terms of population shifts in America. The central concentration of American populations prior to 1890, or 1790 rather, are represented in the areas of pink on the map. Notice you've got a small island on the Ohio River around Louisville, Kentucky, and as a major river area, Cincinnati kind of being in that area as well as transportation hubs, rivers being the original highways in the pre-road and even in the road era. We see then by the 1820s, the antebellum era we're talking about, the population is thrust almost like a dagger, two daggers into the vitals of the nation. And it is no coincidence the way they've gone. They've followed the Ohio River all the way down to the Mississippi and up the Missouri, and they've also followed the Tennessee River south and also working their way towards the Gulf Coast, tying together with the Mississippi and Baton Rouge, New Orleans, etc. So we see the patterns filling in along the river routes first and then sort of bleeding and spreading back to other areas. By the green, you have 1840. We fill in the areas back behind. Spanish Florida being purchased in 1819. We see a lot of development there. And of course, working our way west past the Mississippi. Notice the narrow amount of extension you have by 1860. By then, you're coming upon issues of civil war. Territorial expansion is slowing down because of this new national crisis. But that's a different lesson for a different time. But it's enough for you to see the evolutionary expansion and ways in which population movements shot west and then sort of bled outwards, north and south, to kind of spread and even out the map as we went along. So for this population, we have a combination of immigration booms and, of course, natural biological increase taking place during this time. America, as we'd said in earlier units, had gotten the reputation as the best poor man's country in the world, and that was evidenced both by the population seeking to come here and additionally by the lower death rates that you saw of people now staying here. We're beyond the colonial era where you have a conveyor belt of people, dying as soon as they get here. We're more or less beyond that model at this point in time. Now, when it comes to business growth, that population serves a vital purpose. They're both going to be the labor pool for manufacturing, actually doing the manufacturing, and they're also going to be the consumers of manufactured and produced goods. So the population is actually sort of feeding upon itself. The more people that come, the more goods need to be produced. The more goods that need to be produced, the more people you need to produce them, which is going to encourage more people to come, or to increase the standard of living, as people are getting paid a living wage and are now going to be able to not live just at the margins of survival. And that population is going to grow and kind of feed upon itself in an economic sense, growing the economy. Secondly, you have the corporation as a business form during this time. And with the corporation, you have capital, which is an economics word, an AP word. Capital is money available for investment. And notice that the money available for investment was not just coming from the United States, it was also coming from overseas. Europeans who had excess capital, excess money to invest from their profits from production, having gone through the Industrial Revolution first in Northern and Western Europe, they saw American transportation industries, American production industries that were emerging as sort of it's equivalent today of like investing in a Microsoft or something like that. They saw it as being can't-miss growth industries that they were going to turn a profit on, because as an investor with excess capital, the goal of your money is not just to have your money sit there, it's to have your money put in a spot where it can make you even more money. And so if these railroads, canals, and roads were being built, they were certainly going to be used by Americans. They weren't going to be used for free. Americans were going to pay to use these in many ways. And as such, that money would then turn into profit for the investor. So European companies and banks and financial holdings, as well as American ones, saw American industry and American transportation models as being great places to invest money as can't-miss emergent technologies that were going to be extremely attractive for investment. Thirdly, unlike many of the nation-states of Southern and Western Europe, the United States was a labor-starved region. In other words, we were not essentially a peasant society, like what you would have seen in Tsarist Russia during this time. In peasant societies, there's a major de-incentive to mechanize, because to mechanize takes away any means of labor and subsistence for the working peasant classes. And to have a whole lot of people who outnumber the elites, who are poor, with no economic future options and nothing to lose, that's a great way for revolutions to begin. So there always needs to be something for those people to do. So changing the current economic models in Southern and Eastern Europe was not as easy of a thing as it was here in the United States. As a labor-starved region, you had a major incentive here to mechanize. As many people who came, there weren't enough to do the tasks that were performed. You had a major incentive to invent, which is why you saw invention being driven by the Industrial Revolution in Northern and Western Europe, and also by the United States as well. And this is part of the evolution that you see in the United States from cottage industry, which is sort of home production, making a modest amount of extra material to perhaps sell, but mostly to use for myself, being produced in my cottage, in my house, to what you would know then as the factory system, where increasingly you would have the factors, the elements of production, more and more taking place under one roof. And the biggest example we see of this for the time period of these sort of changes begins in textiles, and begins in New England towns and places like Lowell, Massachusetts, where you see more and more of the raw materials being brought in the door and finished goods being put out the door. And this has its origins in many ways in some labor models that we'll get to in our next slide. But the consequences of industry, before we get there, is this thing called de-skilling of the workforce. And what it is as you take productive tasks that used to be performed by a cabinet maker, or a gunsmith, or a cooper, or a master tailor, and you break them down into their component parts, which is what takes place in a factory. For instance, in a factory, in an auto plant today, no one auto worker builds the entire car. They may just be the person who puts the windshield on the car, or they put the tires on the car, or they put the hubcaps on the tires on the car. But you understand my point. You're taking the tasks and breaking them down small enough that labor becomes almost its own interchangeable cog in the industrial machine. This is very different than the old artisanal craftsman model, where what I could do with my hands, the skills I had, made me valuable. And the skills that a star NFL or NBA athlete has makes them valuable because they can do things that no other person can do, or very few others can do. They can command high salaries for that. If you can do something that anybody else can do, well, you don't really have a big incentive to make, you don't have a big case to make for why you deserve greater compensation or greater benefits package than you already have. And this is the big threat of what industrialization does to the workforce, and the workforce knew it. The workforce, with the old guilds, the old trade unions and craftspeople model, they resisted and fought this model of what they called wage slavery. With wage slavery, the model was that I didn't have a whole lot of skills. I, as a worker, was dependent on having that job. I needed the factory more than the factory needed me, as opposed to the model of free labor, where my knowledge, what I could take from my brain and do with my hands, my knowledge gave me power. And I could choose who, when, and where to work, and the pace I was going to work at as well. And this is this dynamic about control the shop floor. We're seeing control the shop floor gradually shift. Historically, the master craftsman had controlled the rate of production, the conditions of labor, etc., because if they decided not to work at a quicker pace or decide not to work on any given day or take the day, as a short day or half day or whatever, there was very little the factory owner, the foreman could do about it, because you couldn't replace those people. They knew what they knew, and their knowledge made them valuable. With de-skilling, we see a shift, a transition, a tectonic shift start to take place as the workforce now has less of that authority to control the shop floor, because the pace is being dictated by management, who has broken tasks into component parts that anyone can do. And if you don't do them to management's satisfaction, we will dismiss you and replace you with a new immigrant, or replace you with a current American citizen who will take that job and be glad to have it. This was the big shift or transition that was taking place in American labor, or began to take place in American labor in the antebellum era.